Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. We are here to talk about space today. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. I am joined by Ludwig Müller, the Director of the European Space Policy Institute, and Bruegel's own Reinhilde Vögelers, who is writing a space blueprint for Europe that will be available soon if it is not already on the Bruegel website. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Ludwig, can you tell us about space in Europe specifically, and where we are and who's involved and how far we have to go besides the stars?
Yeah, thank you first for having me, and appreciate this topic on space and in relation with economy, which actually is already one of the headings of the Times. We had a nomination for the new director of the new head of NASA, who actually comes as an entrepreneur into the business, and we can see this as a major indicator that space increasingly is moving into the world of economics. We know that at the same time, it also has arrived in the times of geopolitics and coming to Europe, as you said, with Ukraine and the conflict around the corner. This is certainly one of the most impacting things of recent times. And it has raised the question on how far space can provide solutions also in the domain of security and defense. And next to this is really human space exploration and everybody going to the moon. And also in Europe, the question being asked how Europe should be engaging as a passenger or co-passenger, as a customer, or as somebody who's co-leading. And third but not least, we are in the times of mega constellations. We're in the times of Elon Musk, of Starlink, and I like to call this the internet age of space. And right now in Europe, asking the question, should we have and support an own European constellation for secure connectivity, which also should allow commercializations for other services. So it is about the economy, it is about geopolitics, it is about the internet age of space, and all three have arrived in Europe.
So much going on right now. Reinhilde, help us figure out who the players are. We've got government generally, then we have the U.S. government versus the EU versus the EU member states. We have other actors around the world like China, and we've also got companies in the private sector who work with governments and who work on their own. How do we think through all that?
So that's really the complicated picture that you have to look at when you look at space here. It used to be really very much driven by states, particularly because it was mostly focusing on space exploration, the scientific and the defense part here. And then, of course, here traditionally Russia and most importantly the US, also some other countries, but it was mostly those two here. And Europe also, in that respect, was certainly for space exploration important partner. But as was already said, we have really seen, thanks to a lot of technological opportunities, much more impact from the commercial side of it. And that meant that actually the company players actually became way more important, not just as purely suppliers, but also as demand of space services. And the satellite communications is a very important component out of that. It also created on the supply side, not just the typical large companies that were very often also, again, US companies and a few large European companies. Also increasingly a wave of startup of new companies that actually were operating in mostly in the downstream space services sector, but also in the upstream and in the launch segments here. And Elon Musk SpaceX is a very good example of that, but it's not the only one here. But again, the US is actually the most important landscape for these new commercial companies active in space here, both on the supply side as well as on the demand side for space services here. Europe is of course still has its very important incumbent players here, but it's particularly on this new startup scene, and particularly those startups that could actually scale to critical size in the space sector is lagging behind.
Ludwig, what's your sense of new people trying to get into the space business, and particularly in Europe?
New is certainly something that usually new dynamics, and in a sense it's something that is also happening and needed in space. Yet we probably need to recall a little bit the ecosystem in which this is happening, and not only in Europe. It's a globally valid picture. 85% of space is publicly funded, which means 15% are private funded. It's the 15% that today give the biggest dynamics, and this is what we want to grow. And when we talk space economy, this is part of the debate, but we need to see from where we are starting. We need to see how that compares Europe versus, for instance, the US, and we have a factor of 1 to 5. So it gives you an idea on scale, and we need certainly to scale up. But we have success stories. We have now initiatives where the public side takes anchor customership, where you make commitments for data or services that you will acquire, and behind this you have a market that develops solutions. We have, for instance, the exploration company raised 150 million of the funding round. We have about 1 billion of venture capital on the European side in the system right now. This is growing. We need to make sure that as these new kids, if we want to call them this way, are emerging, that they can scale up, that they can survive what is commonly called a valley of death, when money has become again more expensive, when return on invest in space is often in the range of 5 to 7 years, when a lot of OpEx infrastructure invest often is required. So we are in a situation that has the right direction. It, I think, accelerates in this direction, and it has a scale outside Europe that provides dynamics for space access of the planet to exist and grow. And we need to find mechanisms, public-private engagement, that this can also scale up in Europe. The exploration company, they are developing cargo vehicles to the space station. It's the first phase of a contract that they got under competition from the European Space Agency. And it's a good example where you have an initial public upfront invest, you have a potential anchor customer on the horizon, and you create a commercial dynamic where private money is engaging.
Super interesting, and a great example also for Europe's efforts to build more of a capital markets union, a favorite Bruegel topic and a favorite topic of mine. Reinhilde, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually would like to add to this, in the sense that indeed public funding is important. The government is an important anchor customer, but also if we look a bit at success stories of the US, private funding is also super important, and particularly private risk capital funding here. If we look at the success stories of like SpaceX, that very important, of course, was initially the risk that the entrepreneur was willing to take, in this case Elon Musk, but also a venture capital market willing to support these initial risk stages here. But the reason why you can attract this private funding is because there is this likelihood of getting access to private funding with NASA, and also for the US. I think what's really very important is public funding is the fact that it also a large part comes comes from defense spending here, the DoD. And that's where I think the EU really has a problem. On the one hand, because its size of public funding is restricted, because it's also fragmented, and it's also it misses quite a lot this link with defense spending. So that's why the anchor role that governments in the EU can play is much more restricted. And that makes it also, on top of that, the fact that we are a risk capital market, like you, Rebecca, know very well, is much less developed. Capital market union is. So it makes it much more difficult to have a good public-private connection of private and public funding here realized for space. And that's really important because in space, that's deep tech here. So that requires large-scale funding here. And I think that's really a challenge that Europe has to take into account here, so that on top of the usual problems we have with making sure that we get a much more vibrant venture capital market and private funding, that there is also this problem of fragmentation and small size and not defense use of the public sector to have it as an anchor in this interface.
If I just can violently agree, because if there is one game changer that really could also on a European level make the difference, that this is really to full benefits of security and defense. And globally, that number is about 50% of the public funding today is on the security and defense side. And it's the part that is still increasing. And with what is happening around us, you can imagine that this is going to continue as a trend. Since the war in Ukraine, I think the awareness has changed. I think there are national governments that are stepping up. It probably will reach also this domain, but we've seen in Ukraine that connectivity through Starlink, Earth observation through Maxa, many US means that have demonstrated also to the wider public the role of space in these conflicts. I think this has certainly triggered a reflection in Europe. I wouldn't say it has triggered yet action and significant funding, but again, this is going in the right direction. It's probably, or certainly today, not at scale and not yet at speed, but this combination and really leverage also the civilian side. The innovation is dual. The technologies in many of these solutions, Earth observation satellites, communication satellites, navigation signals, they are in their utilization, they are dual in use. This is something that we need to become more aware of and support an ecosystem that leverages this. This will not resolve the problem, as you mentioned rightly, Reinhilde, the risk capital market in Europe is not the same as in the US. And I'm not sure whether they will be changing this tomorrow, and it will not change specifically for space. But to engage in public anchor customerships to stimulate and scale up, I think this is something we can do, and we have cases where the market is responding.
I really like to emphasize indeed that we need a European Capital Markets Union also for space here, but that goes beyond. But I really want to emphasize the use of this dual use here, because that really creates also the incentives of why we might attract risk capital funding here. And this dual use, I think, is really important, not just only for space to be able to use defense as a customer, but also for defense, because it's only the fact that you have all these technologies available and that can be deployed and further developed for defense makes it also for defense a much more attractive option to actually use the technologies and the players that are already available in the commercial sector. But that also means that the anchor role that the public sector should be playing is really going full speed for this dual use here and really trying to include as much as possible what's already available and how you can leverage that private sector here, rather than as an afterthought of maybe there could be some commercial spin-offs from what we're doing. No, you have to do this ex ante.
Thanks for that. So as we move into the next section of our podcast, I want to come back a little bit more to the funding of this. Here at Bruegel, some of our colleagues have written about possibly using EU funds for air defense, so bringing in more joint funding for security. However, joint funding for industrial policy is much more fraught, and so to the extent these technologies are dual use, it raises a question of what can Europe pay for at the joint level versus the member state level. And we also have some experience that around the world, systems that were supposed to pay for themselves or help pay for themselves with private sector take-up have not really delivered. With telecommunications, for example, governments have often invested with the hope that the private sector would come in and they would become profitable, and it hasn't happened. What can we learn from that? Brynhilde, Ludwig?
Yeah, maybe first on the telecom. I think the telecom is, in fact, a commercial market. The level of public investment into telecom compared to the size of the market is small. So this is truly, if you look into the revenues of, we can also talk about the European operators, so the Eutelsats and the SESs and others, they have significant market share, and this is not carried by public contracts. What is happening right now is that because of the change of infrastructure to low Earth orbit satellite constellations and Starlink and Amazon Kuipers coming and China coming, the infrastructure and services are changing, and that puts a threat to the telecom sector in Europe. But I think telecom otherwise is a good example. If you go back to 1985, when these operators were founded in Europe, this is when the commercialization of this segment started. And I think it's a good story. Now, how do we go and leverage this into other segments? It's a different challenge. And we just talked about launchers, and they are essential. You need launchers to have autonomy in putting up your systems in space. But the launcher part of the space economy is 2%. I actually doubt that launches per se is something where you have a direct return on invest. And what Elon Musk does is he uses the launchers to do Starlink, and the return on invest is on the telecommunication services. And the launchers are a means to an end. Earth observation is a case maybe a bit in between. Today, the share of the space economy is about 4%, very small. It has a lot of institutional use, but it's certainly something where there is an opportunity for commercialization. So what is the growth rate you can aim at for the years to come? It can be significant, but you're still a smaller part of the space economy. So when we talk about private investment, I think we need to differentiate between the different sectors of the economy, and some are more mature than others. And when we do investments, we need to be strategic enough to make that distinction. There are some that need to invest, and they will be small in time to grow. There are others that are, like Starlink, is shaking the boat. It is something where you need to be present, and our operators need to be present, which is why they invest in the OneWeb mergers and the likes. Yeah, we've seen this. And maybe we could have done a few things in Europe a bit early, but I think it's still the time to do it right, and we need to really accelerate.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, I think it's really important to look at the different segments of the value chain in space, where what role the particular private players actually play, and that's indeed different. So you have the satellite demand from telecom. You have also a lot of the services that run on these satellites, and that's a lot of smaller companies here. Not often the telecom operators are actually offering those service activities here. So that small scale startups have definitely an option here. But if we look more upstream, and particularly the launch activities, equipment, and services, the question there is, that's of course not for lots of startups and small companies here. That's a kind of natural monopoly almost. But I like to emphasize that so basically SpaceX, which is a startup, is active along the whole value chain here. So it's actually vertically integrated. It has the launch facilities. It also has its own satellites and operates this. And that I think is also quite important to have a look at from the European perspective. So we might actually ask ourselves, do we need a launch activity here? But this vertical integration actually is also very important, and particularly it might create a lot of strategic autonomy if problems if we don't have any access to those launch facilities here. If there can be vertical exclusion by the monopoly holders, and in that respect, we have to think also of what position do we want to take in the launch equipment as well. But of course, to see also at what cost that we actually can do this here, because of course SpaceX is very efficient in this, very cost efficient here for the moment. So at what cost can we actually compete within those segments here? But I think we really have to also look at the vertical integration, the conglomerate nature of a lot of the large players here, and that's why it's really the whole ecosystem of conglomerates as well as startups where we have to see what role Europe can actually play in creating value.
I think we're talking a lot about SpaceX here, but what about Ariane? What about the French Guiana launch capabilities? It's not like Europe has nothing.
Ariane is, I think, an essential piece for autonomous access to space. And I think it's the right thing to do. I'm sure we all agree that we want this whole sector to develop further and to have more diversity of offer. You need resilience in the system. You do not want a single place to launch from. You do not want a single rocket to depend upon, but you want European launch capability. So when you need it, you will have it. At the same time, we will also be using other launchers on the planet and vice versa. And I think this is okay in an economy where actually you also cooperate with other capabilities. But let me come back to the point, and Ragnhilde, you hit it with the vertical integration. So the launch is one thing, but the satellites you launch is the next thing, and the cars you connect with the satellites you launch is the next thing. And now we can say there's another model, Amazon and Kuipers, where you have somebody who, in terms of capitalization, he can do it from his own means. And he can actually afford to buy launchers all over the planet. It's one of the biggest customers. It is the biggest customer today of Ariane 6. But then you also have a chain of a constellation capability, but you have Amazon Web Services wrapped around it. You have e-commerce as core of your business, and you have a vertical integration. Now, what is a reflection for Europe in this? And it's maybe the biggest point in all of the debate. If you say the market is really not upstream, it is downstream, and we probably would all agree, then the question is, what does space mean for automotive? What does space mean for pharmaceuticals? What does space mean for all the sectors that define our economy today? And if you look into what is happening, in China, Geely are developing for their cars an own satellite constellation. Does any European company do that? No. Elon Musk happens to have Tesla, and he happens to have Starlink. And I can promise you, we will have that tendency that industry sectors will integrate their core business with space as an enabler, as a key enabler, as a key distinguishing feature. And the comparison I like to make is micro semiconductors. You would not measure the economic value of semiconductor by the size of the industry that produces semiconductors. We certainly want to measure it by the impact on the whole of the economy. And there are some data out there, and maybe in Bruegel you have better data on this, but people are talking about a multiplier of about 7. So you have an investment and you have an economy of the enabling technology, but the true benefit is 7-fold in all the other sectors. And we see this happening. It may be at the early stage in space, but we see this happening in space. And the difference is that A, you don't have too many of these technologies, maybe 5, 6, 7, depending how you count. And B, luckily, space, we are still at a stage where we can step up. the game is not being played out. And I hope we will not, in 20 years from now, look back and say, at the time, we didn't get on the boat. We didn't do we repeated the same mistake as we did in semiconductors 20 years ago from today. But we really stepped up and we really developed the benefits for all these industries I just mentioned.
Yeah, I really also believe that we haven't lost the game yet. I cannot afford to think differently here. But I do think that really we need to understand where the games are actually being played here. So there is still a lot of technology development taking place here where we can still be on the right boat. But I think it really requires also a vision of space, really focusing on this is mostly about satellites and communication and connectivity here. That's where most of the room will actually also be for follow-on commercial activities here. And this is how we have to see this here. Like if you mention what's the importance for our car sector, if you think of autonomous driving, we will need satellite communication as an important component of this. So we have to really see space as a platform technology here for a lot of commercial activities. And that's indeed not yet present. And I'm a bit afraid that in Europe, we might be missing this because we don't have the same, certainly in comparison to the US, because we don't have the same kind of creative destruction, dynamic, innovative ecosystem where the players, startup players as well as incumbents are actually taking this opportunity that space technologies might offer for the next generation of their offerings. And that's a bit of a problem that should be addressed by a much more general policy perspective on how we can make our European economy much more innovation active and contestable here. And that means also really making sure that we go for a much more competition in a large single and open market here so that we get that drive from bottom up from our companies here. The question is what role the governments can still play in making sure that we don't miss that opportunity the next time, and what kind of lead and anchor role should it be playing to initiate that kind of initiative here. That I think really requires way more than just incrementally having a bit more budget here. That's really also a completely different role on what role the governments should be playing here. So it's not just we need more procurement, we need a different way of procuring here so that we really can activate that kind of bottom-up reaction from the private market here and leverage the kind of activities we have in the private market. So it's way more than just funding here. It's really...
So coming back to this question of what can the public fund and how does that interact with the private sector? We've seen, and thank you, Ludwig, examples of the private sector being very successful in some industries. We've also seen some very successful government programs. Are there any examples of government programs that were budgeted from the beginning as the government will pay for X amount and we will get Y revenue from the private sector, where the private sector has actually delivered and filled in that gap rather than leaving a cost overrun for the public sector to backfill?
Yeah, it's a big question. So let's go to Galileo or GPS. And I think in both cases, that computation didn't exist. It has been put into a market that over all the years in both systems has not led to a private market investment into, for instance, the next generation of the upstream infrastructure in space. So this is a public investment because it provides certain services that are for, say, can be climate change monitoring, weather forecasting, navigation, can be used also in dual applications. And this has been done upfront without a requirement of a specific return. And now increasingly is used to encourage downstream development. And if I take Earth observation, you see now some companies that also invest in upstream and develop their own system. Yeah, but it has not been a part of the design from the outset. In telecommunications, it may be a different story because this is actually happening in a market. As I said before, the operators today are already operating mega revenues in the commercial market. Now, Europe is stepping up on the IRIS² program. It's going to be a 12 billion public invests and maybe more. And it has two objectives, in fact. One is to provide governmental services, which is why it exists. But the second reason why it exists, and I think it's, as far as I'm concerned, almost the more important one, it shall allow commercialization. So it asks for co-investments from the beginning in the construction of the program from the private side, something that never existed in any of the operational programs, not in meteorology, not in navigation, not in Earth observation. It's first time. And that contract should be signed this month. So by the time this airs, we will see whether we will have a contract on this. That would come with an investment engagement of the private side. Now, I think it is up to the private side to develop the business that this investment actually gives them the return they need. I do not believe that there is a requirement on return on investment on the private side in the construct of the public-private partnership, but inside the company, I'm pretty sure, more than ever, by the way, that the board will assess what are the chances to get a return on the private money I put into a public-private partnership today. And that is a good dynamic. It's a very good example. It has existed before in telecommunications, but this is the first time that it's really happening on that scale. And it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I like to add to that by still having a bit more of a cautious perspective on this, in the sense that like what you were saying, what we are still missing, I think, is a sufficiently innovative, active, and dynamic ecosystem at the bottom that will actually be willing to take up their public-private share in the public-private partnership. And I think that's something that really makes or illustrates how important it is that for the space economy, we need a much broader policy agenda than only looking at particular space projects like Copernicus or like IRIS. They're very good initiatives, but they won't work if we don't have a general policy that is much more systemic and really also looks at who are the downstream users of these space platform technologies, and to make sure that there is enough incentives for that. So a more general framework policies to enhance framework conditions like the Capital Market Union we were talking about, like the 28 regime that we would need in order to make sure that we have way more larger scale companies operating in these markets. And of course also our incumbent firms are very important, but they very often need to be contested by companies that can sufficiently take on board these new technology opportunities and be contesting the incumbents, the strong incumbents that we might have, to make them way more active here. So it's much more than just only looking at what kind of particular space projects could we be doing in a public-private partnership here. It's really leashing the private incentives from all the sectors, and these sectors are very multiple here, so it really goes beyond space pure. But what I also would like to emphasize is it's really important also to have not just only smaller companies, startup companies active in the space sector. There's a lot of emphasis on this, trying to get more startup activities in space. That will be mostly also smaller scale and in the downstream sectors here. But as we already emphasized, I think we really need to have a perspective on space across the whole value chain here. And so we also need to make sure that we get players that can actually have this vertical integration perspective as well here. And that's way more challenging.
And if I can again agree entirely, maybe one of the most important words in our discussion is really the vertical integration. We should be realistic that this hasn't really happened anywhere on the planet so much. Now, this is not a primarily just a European challenge. If I simplify, you go back in the US, space in the US is driven by two things, and you make it or not. One is so discovery of the universe. This is the NASA budget, 25 billion a year. This is your vertical, if you like, your justification, your raison d'etre, which is not questioned, which keeps NASA going over all the decades. And the other one you mentioned is security and defense. It's the Pentagon, which, by the way, just issued a strategy to integrate commercial with military solutions. Now, anything in between, when we say pharmaceutical, biotech, transport, energy, and all the sectors that should be concerned, if we really holistic approach, and I think you're right. We need this policy approach across the system. I don't think this has happened anywhere much. And if I can take, if you correct me, Ranhilde, I'm happy to listen to the examples. The point is that take Japan. In Japan, what you see is again a different system. You have big corporations. You have the Hitachis and the Toyotas and others. They are not space, but they have a business. And if they engage in space, basically they become integrated industry that also does space. And this is something that in Europe we also do not have. So we are caught between two lovers, if you want, where in the US it's an established system that now has a risk capital market that can do more. And you see this in commercial space stations now, where people go for pharmaceutical and biotech and others. And you have Japan that maybe increasingly will leverage from the industrial structures they have. And Europe has to find a policy in its own way.
Yeah, I really like this discussion. So what I would like to put forward, and it's perhaps a bit of my bias from looking at it from the innovation angle, I think we should actually look at the technology rather than the uses of the technology in the different space components and beyond here. It's what kind of technologies or kind of platform technologies that are dual use, that can be used in many different, like for security, like space exploration, like connectivity, like climate change. So it's really at the technology stage, trying to use multiple use, dual use, and perhaps even multiple use of that technology, for which space can be a very important, again, anchor application here, but it's just only one of these applications. And it's at this stage of development, when technologies still need to be developed for applications, that I think a very important role is for policy to make sure that those kind of technology developments and projects get actually funded. And that's exactly what I like to see that DARPA actually is doing to some extent, but on a very small scale, of course. But it also requires sometimes only very few successful projects here. And they actually select those projects where there is a clear defense objective here, but not purely a defense objective. So they really look for dual use applications here, where they can both leverage on what's already being done in the private sector, and where they can also motivate the private sector to be involved, because there are other uses of those technologies for their own applications. And it's that kind of perspective that we're missing in Europe. We don't have a kind of DARPA agency where actually the procurement or the policy mission really comes from not just only your own objectives in terms of security or exploration, but really have this multiple use from the start. And a bit of a problem that we have in Europe is that our institutional landscape is very complex. So we have ESA, that's really focused on civil applications for exploration.
The European Space Agency.
European Space Agency, sorry. And then you have the ones which are more responsive for the industrial policy perspective. That's the EU DG Growth and Defis Commission, part of the Commission. You have defense. For defense, we don't have anything. And then you have the national here. So it's very much fragmented, and not only fragmented in national versus EU, but also fragmented in exploration, civil, defense, well, nothing for defense, and industrial policy. And that makes it very difficult actually to have that more early stage technology dual use perspective for policy making here.
So the U.S. definitely does have an advantage with some of this government funding for research and for prototypes. DARPA is primarily for early stage stuff and not for things that are going to be produced at scale. We've also seen in the U.S. a huge change in the contractor universe, because Boeing and Lockheed, which were so dominant for such a long time, are no longer the players that come to people's minds and the players that people talk about. So the U.S. government contractor ecosystem has not done a good job of managing that legacy capacity. Ludwig, are there lessons Europe can learn from that?
DARPA, and you just explained on which level they innovate, is one element. It's certainly one key element. But if you look at the whole system, you have, for instance, have a National Space Council attached to the vice president of the USA. You have, next to NASA, you have the DoD, you have the Space Development Agency. You have a whole ecosystem that really, as a whole, in a certain way. So we will not solve the European question by having a DARPA. That is a piece in a puzzle. And maybe to then come to what Europe can do. You look in the Draghi report, and he said, we're actually not too bad in innovation. We're actually not too bad in the innovation that is more mid-scale innovation. But we're doing bad in two things: anything that is disruptive, and we're doing bad in transferring innovation into commercialization. And that is so, it's not space specific, but it's also true for space. And I think then the question is, what are the players that you have to consider in the formula? And you mentioned ESA, the European Space Agency, the Commission. Yes, that's on the European level. Europe is also the nations of Europe. And if you say space, 80%, more than 80% of the space funding, public space funding in Europe is in member states' budgets. And about 60% actually go through ESA in an intergovernmental mechanism. So whatever formula we want to improve, I think that formula will have to operate across that whole ecosystem. We made a comment on the Draghi report, and our title on it is "It Takes a Village." Yeah, it is not just a single structure and a king. It is really, it takes the participation of all, and it takes, as you said, Ranhilde, the innovation component, and maybe not just it should be close to what you can scale. I think that should also be the right level. We need the basic research, but we also need something that we can scale tomorrow. But it needs the policy link. It needs the two. It is not just that the innovation will solve it. If you just put DARPA on the map, it will not solve it. We need to reach the politicians to understand that there is an opportunity, a benefit of space in energy transition, in future mobility, in the health sector and others, because those are the things that matter to people, they matter to politicians, and it is a fair thing to say we need to be measurable in what we contribute as space in these sectors, because it is not space for the sake of space. We do not do space infrastructure, and not even downstream, for the sake of the industry that operates it. It is the value you create out of the systems with the data and information, and then ultimately the application and use. It sounds straightforward. It is very hard to do. I think nobody really does it, not in Europe. And this is why I think it is still an opportunity for us.
As we head into the last section of this podcast, I would now like to turn to some recommendations for how we can move forward. Ranhilde, you have been working on this space blueprint with collaborators. It has a series of very focused recommendations. Walk us through what you're putting forward.
Yeah, so indeed, with my collaborators, Camille Sequit and Francesco Nicola, we've been working on the space sector for already quite a long time. And the recommendations are, of course, they are not easy, because it really requires much more different kinds of knots that you have to tie at the same time. But you have to find the ones that are really critical to really leverage the whole system. What we definitely would like to see is, on the one hand, making sure that the anchor role that we can play from the public sector, that Europe beefs up this, and not just by looking at more funding, but also trying to make sure that the fragmentation of this procurement is actually addressed, and also changing the procurement, the way in which you address procurement, by making it way more innovative, focusing on installing competition, next generation, rather than focusing on covering fixed cost as much as possible. So that's very important, but this will not work if we don't have the vibrant private innovation ecosystem at the same time here. And for that, I think what's really important is that we have also some very dedicated projects which focus on the very early stage of technology development, with emphasizing the multiple uses of the technology. So I'm still thinking of a kind of DARPA that could play that role here, but a role in which it's also has a clear focus on trying to really initiate and empower the private sector developments at the same time. And of course, we're hoping also for the more general policy recommendations of upbeating our innovation system in Europe here with capital markets union, with also single market 28 regime. So all of that at the same time here.
The 28th regime, for those of you following along, is a proposal to lift certain aspects of European business regulation to the European level while also allowing the nations and member states to continue with their own regulation. It's tricky to do. It's had some success in a few very specific legal frameworks. And there's a lot of discussion right now about how to do this in finance, about how to do this in other ways. But we digress. Ludwig, space, what do you want to see happening? We've got a new institutional cycle. We've got a new focus and awareness of defense. Where are we going?
Last year, we published what we call the SP 2040 Vision for Space, for Prosperity, Peace, and Future Generations. And in this, we laid down what we propose to our stakeholders, which are the agencies, which are also industry members, which is the wider European community. And we laid down basically 3 layers of activity. And I'll be very short on this. The foundation, we need to really make sure that we get the talent. We didn't talk about the talent. The word wasn't even mentioned, I believe. It's about people. It's about industry. It's about industrial capability. It's about workforce. Obviously, it's about the finance. We discussed the challenge here. But we need to have the foundation that any industry that wants to impact needs to have. And this is something that is not enough in space programs. Space programs are in capability development, also sometimes even in isolation from the rest. It can create, since you mentioned the US, and even the US has this challenge. So I'm not even talking about the capability part, which is the middle element. You need to have your systems, fair enough. The third element, and the top element, is the policy impact to really bring space into the different digital strategies, green transition strategies, into where budgets are allocated in other sectors, that space is taken on board and not seen as it used to be a corner in itself and some kind of an R&D entertainment for some people. And next to it, do the same with the big companies and emerging entrepreneurs and really go and get their cases. So those are the 3 levels: policy impact, capability development, and foundation when it comes to talent and people and money. When it comes to more specifics, green is not enough anymore. A lot of the European space agenda has been driven by climate change, which shouldn't change. I'm not saying that, but this is okay. It's good and it should continue, but it is not enough. It is not enough to scale. You see it in the election results in the European Parliament, in government changes across Europe. So what needs to step up, and we said it, is economic value of space. Was the first requirement when we did an analysis on the European elections. Where does space appear? It's economic value. And there has been a US president that many years ago already made the point, not specific for space, but it is true here. What else? Security and defense. This is the game changer. We all seem to agree on this. I would add something we haven't mentioned: space for diplomacy. Artemis Accords, what the US are doing, what China is doing, what India will be doing increasingly. Europe has to be on the map to use space as a means of diplomacy. And last but not least, and maybe the biggest, to get into a clear European policy and strategy for space, because that does not exist. We need to frame this. And I would agree again with Reinhilde that this is not just a space policy for the space domain. It is space in the bigger policy context strategy. And do this with the nations, with the EU, with the ESAs and others. And if there is a DARPA, we will do it also with the DARPA, but DARPA will take 5 or 10 years to be there, and things will have happened in the meantime. That would be my comment. And then really consciously and also funding-wise, we need an ecosystem built that goes beyond the space bubble into the verticals, into the innovators, into countries like Switzerland that is great innovators. Europe has great innovating countries. If you look in the innovation index, planetary-wise, we are super, we are doing great. Let's tap space into this. And there is more than this, but I keep it at this level. So there's a lot to be done. I repeat, the time is still right.
Yeah, I also still think time is still right here, but we also should not underestimate how much effort it will require from us. There is no excuse. We should get going here. We also don't know what will work and what will not work, but we have to be very experimental, risk-taking also in policy making here, but really try to very short monitor what works and what doesn't work. Where are the really critical bottlenecks that we need to address here in this much more broader systemic policy approach here? But this is why I think this DARPA, which I would really try to push forward here, I agree it won't be the solution because it has to fit within a well-functioning overall ecosystem that's innovative, but it might be something that can actually trigger these kind of advantages that we would have in the system here, and that's why I would really try to work this out as an experiment here. But it requires really an independent agency with a lot of expertise at the level of the policy officers to know which kind of projects to choose here that have that leverage component. So I do agree that the skills are also very important here, but maybe in that respect we should also be sufficiently European to think of scale and also open here. So the labor market for attracting skills here should be international open.
Thank you for that. DARPA, of course, the United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and one that has been present in this area for many decades now. So lots to learn from, lots to think about. We have had such a fun discussion today. Thank you, Ludwig Müller from the European Space Policy Institute. Listeners, please go check out their report and their recommendations. We also have Bruegel's Reinhilde Vögelers, who, if you aren't already reading her work on innovation, on talent development, on cross-border cooperation, really essential, really great stuff in the Space Blueprint. And then I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel, and I'm thrilled to have had this conversation about space today. You can find our work on our website, bruegel.org, and all your favorite podcast channels. Thanks for listening. See you next time.